Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're taking a deep dive into something that's probably been on your mind lately. I mean, it seems like it's always on everyone's mind these days.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Inflation. We've got some excerpts here from an economics textbook,
Okay.
and it's all about monetary policy and the price level. We're going to break it all down
Sounds good.
for you. By the end of
All
this,
right.
you'll understand how inflation works, what causes it, and most importantly, how it affects you.
Yeah, your wallet.
Yeah, exactly. Hits you right in the wallet.
Yeah.
Before we get into the nitty-gritty, think about your own experiences.
Okay.
Have you noticed, like, your grocery bill getting steeper?
Oh, yeah.
Or maybe that coffee you grab every morning costs a bit more?
Oh, for sure. I've noticed that.
That, my friend, is inflation in action. Basically, it's a rise in the general price level, which means, your money doesn't buy as much as it used to. Remember that candy bar you used to get for $1?
Yeah.
Well, now it might cost you $1.10 for the same thing. That's inflation just eating away at your purchasing power.
Your purchasing power. Yeah, that's a good point. And that concept is directly tied to your standard of living, right? So when inflation is high, your money buys less, and it can feel like you're working harder just to stay afloat.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so we know inflation is happening, but what's causing it? Our source breaks it down into two main categories:
Right.
demand pull and cost push inflation. Can you walk us through those a little bit?
Absolutely. So demand pull inflation happens when, as the name suggests, demand is outstripping supply.
Makes sense.
It's like when a hot new gadget comes out and everybody
Yeah.
wants it,
Oh, yeah.
but there aren't enough to go around. That high demand just pulls those prices up.
So the textbook gives a couple interesting examples of what can fuel this demand pull inflation.
Okay.
Like, for instance, if everybody's income suddenly increases,
Yeah, more money to spend.
they'll have more money to spend, and that can drive up demand, right?
Right?
It also talks about the Irish economic boom and how low interest rates at the time encouraged a borrowing frenzy. Oh, wow.
The textbook even quotes the Taisich from that period saying people went mad borrowing.
Really?
It's pretty crazy.
That's funny.
And we're seeing echoes of that today, actually. After pandemic restrictions eased, everyone was eager to travel and the demand for flights exploded.
Oh, yeah.
Airlines, seeing that surge in demand, they naturally raised their prices.
Of course.
Just classic demand pull inflation.
Yeah, makes sense.
So demand pull is all about too much money chasing too few goods.
Okay.
What about cost push inflation? How does that one work?
So cost push inflation is all about rising production costs.
Oh.
You can think about it this way. If a business has to pay more for labor, energy, or the raw materials they need, well, they have to pass those increased costs on to you, the consumer,
Right.
in the form of higher prices.
It's like a chain reaction.
Yeah.
The textbook highlights a few examples, like the recent wave of labor strikes. When workers negotiate for higher wages, businesses often have to raise their prices to cover those added costs. Exactly. And we can't forget about the elephant in the room, soaring energy costs.
Mm.
Those high prices for oil and gas have a domino effect on the whole economy.
Right.
Think about how much it costs to transport goods
Yeah.
or even just heat your home. Those energy costs are basically baked into the prices of almost everything.
Yeah, energy prices are a big deal. The textbook also uses the example of lumber prices
Okay.
and how those increases impacted home construction costs. That's like a real-world example of how those raw material costs can lead to cost-push
That
inflation.
makes sense. Yeah, it all adds up.
Yeah, but our textbook says there's more to the story. Beyond just supply and demand, there are some other culprits behind inflation.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
It's not always as straightforward as those basic economic principles.
Right.
There are other forces at play.
I see.
For example, there are indirect taxes, like the VAT on fuel,
Yeah.
which directly impacts what you pay at the pump. And then there's imported inflation,
Yeah.
which is driven by those global supply chain disruptions we've been hearing so much about.
Yeah, to mention those fluctuating currency exchange rates.
Right.
All those external factors can absolutely wreak havoc on domestic prices.
Sure, they can.
And let's not forget about borrowing and lending.
Okay.
The source highlights how easy access to credit, especially after those government stimulus measures, can lead to more money sloshing around in the economy,
Yeah, I see what you're...
which puts upward pressure on prices.
Makes sense.
And then there's the curious case of interest rates.
Oh, yeah, interest rates.
High interest rates are often used to combat inflation, but the textbook points out that they can actually contribute to it in the short term. How does that work?
That's where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
Higher interest rates are designed to kind of cool down the economy by making it more expensive to borrow money. That can reduce demand and, help bring inflation down over time.
Right.
But here's the catch.
Okay.
Those higher interest rates also increase the cost of things like your mortgage payments. And guess what? Mortgage payments are part of the Consumer Price Index, which is how we measure inflation. Uh-huh.
So you might actually see like a temporary bump in inflation as those higher mortgage costs filter through the system.
So it's not as simple as, higher interest rates always equals lower inflation.
Right.
There's a bit of a delay and a bit of a trade-off.
Yeah, it's a complex dance, and the effects play out over different time frames.
Okay, so we've unpacked some of the reasons why prices might be going up, but why should we care? What happens when inflation gets out of control?
That's the million-dollar question. High inflation can have a domino effect throughout the whole economy, with some serious consequences for everyone, from individuals and businesses to governments.
So what are some of the downsides of high inflation? What does it actually mean for people's lives?
Well, the most immediate impact is on your purchasing power, right? As prices rise, your money just doesn't buy as much. This affects everyone, but it's particularly tough on people living on fixed incomes like retirees.
Because their pensions aren't increasing, but the prices of everything are going up.
Precisely. And this can lead to like a vicious cycle called a wage price spiral.
Okay.
People see their purchasing power eroding, so they demand higher wages to, keep up with the rising cost of living.
Right.
But those higher wages then increase production costs for businesses, so then they're forced to raise their prices even further. It's like a dog chasing its tail.
Yeah, and nobody wins in that scenario.
Right, exactly. High inflation also discourages saving and investment.
Why would you?
Why put money in the bank if its purchasing power is constantly shrinking?
Right, exactly. The textbook also mentions how high inflation can make it harder for Irish businesses to compete in the global market. If our goods become more expensive compared to those from countries with lower inflation,
Right.
we lose our competitive edge.
Absolutely. And if Irish businesses are struggling, that can lead to job losses,
Yeah.
which further impacts the economy.
It's just this cascading effect.
It is.
The textbook also points out another concerning consequence, how inflation can exacerbate wealth inequality.
Yeah, that's a crucial point. Wealthy individuals often hold assets like real estate, which tend to hold their value or even appreciate during inflationary periods. But lower income individuals rely more on cash, which, as we've discussed, loses value as prices rise.
Right, so the gap between the haves and have-nots widens.
It does.
Think about what that means for your own community. Are you seeing this dynamic play out in your own neighborhood? It's something to consider.
It is, yeah.
So we've established that inflation is a real concern, but how do we even know how much prices are rising? How do we measure it?
That's where the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, comes in. It's the main tool used here in Ireland to kind of keep tabs on inflation.
It's like the inflation barometer.
Exactly. The CPI tracks the prices of a basket of goods and services that, represent what the average Irish household buys.
Okay.
Things like food, housing, transportation, healthcare, it's all in there. They measure how those prices change over time to get a sense of how much inflation is happening.
I read that there are over 200 people in 86 locations all over Ireland collecting over 50,000 price quotes every month for this CPI. That's a lot of data.
That's a huge undertaking. And to make sure the CPI is accurate and reflects how people are actually spending their money, they conduct a household budget survey every 5 years.
Okay.
This helps them update the basket of goods and services and, make sure they're giving the right weight to each item.
So if people are buying more electric cars and fewer gasoline cars, the CPI would reflect that shift in spending.
Precisely. It aims to be a dynamic measure of inflation, but it does have its limitations.
Hold on. So if the CPI isn't perfect, how can we get a more accurate sense of how inflation is hitting our own wallets? What specific items in your life have you noticed going up in price the most?
That's a great question. And it's important to remember that the CPI is just an average.
Okay.
Your personal inflation rate might be higher or lower depending on your spending habits.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
The textbook mentions a few limitations of the CPI. For example, it doesn't always account for improvements in quality.
Yeah.
So a price increase might not just be inflation, it might mean you're getting a better product.
Yeah, that's an important nuance. For example, if your smartphone gets a better camera and faster processor, it might cost more, but you're also getting more for your money.
And the CPI can lag behind new products. Since the basket is only updated every 5 years, it might not include the latest and greatest gadgets right away.
Right.
So if, a revolutionary new device comes out and everyone wants it, that price spike might not show up in the CPI immediately.
Exactly.
And then there's that whole average consumer concept.
Yeah,
In reality, everyone's spending patterns are different, so the CPI might not be a perfect reflection of your own experience.
right.
So while the CPI is a useful tool, it's important to be aware of its limitations and how they might affect your own perception of inflation.
It is.
Now, we've talked about what causes inflation, how it affects us, and how it's measured, but what can be done about it? Who's in charge of keeping those prices in check?
Well, both the government and the central bank play crucial roles in combating inflation,
Okay.
but they have different tools at their disposal, and those tools come with limitations.
So let's start with the government. What can they do to try and curb inflation?
Well, the government has some levers they can pull, but they don't have complete control, especially when it comes to external factors like those global oil prices we talked about.
Right.
They can't just, wave a magic wand and make inflation disappear.
So what are some of their options? What can they actually do?
Our source mentions a few specific strategies. For example, they could decrease indirect taxes.
Okay.
So you might see them lower the VAT on fuel to, give people some relief at the pump.
Yeah.
Have you noticed any recent changes in fuel prices where you live?
I think so, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's hard to tell sometimes. They can also increase income tax,
Uh-huh.
which could theoretically reduce how much money people have to spend and therefore cool down demand.
But raising taxes isn't exactly a popular move, especially when people are already feeling the pinch of inflation.
You're absolutely right.
Right.
There's always a political dimension to these decisions.
Yeah.
Another strategy the government can use is to engage in dialogue with social partners,
Okay.
like trade unions, to encourage wage restraint.
It sounds like a tough conversation to have.
It can be.
Yeah.
The goal is to, prevent that wage price spiral we discussed earlier, where rising wages just lead to even higher prices.
Right, right.
You know,
So the government has a few tools in its toolbox, but they're not miracle cures.
no.
What about the central bank? What role do they play in this whole inflation saga?
The central bank has a lot of power when it comes to influencing the money supply. That's the amount of money circulating in the economy. They do this through what's called monetary policy.
Okay, get ready, folks, because this is where things can get a little complex. Our textbook goes into some detail about the mechanisms the central bank can use to try and impact inflation.
Right, it can seem complicated, but let's try to break it down. One key tool is open market operations.
Open market operations. What in the world is that?
It sounds more complicated than it is. Imagine it like a seesaw.
Okay.
If the central bank wants to increase the money supply, it buys government bonds.
Uh-huh.
This injects cash into the economy, pushing that seesaw down on one side. But if they want to decrease the money supply, they sell those bonds,
Okay.
pulling money out and shifting the seesaw the other way.
I see. Okay. And what about quantitative easing? That's another term that gets thrown around a lot.
Yeah.
It sounds pretty intense.
Quantitative easing, or QE, is a bit more direct. It's essentially the central bank creating new money and using it to buy assets, like those government bonds, from banks. This floods the economy with even more cash, lowering interest rates and hopefully encouraging businesses to borrow and invest.
So it's like giving the economy a financial jumpstart.
Yeah, kinda.
But couldn't that lead to even more inflation down the road? It seems a bit risky.
It's a delicate balance for sure.
Yeah.
QE is typically used during times of economic crisis,
Okay.
or when interest rates are already super low and need an extra push.
The textbook also mentions something called reserve requirements.
Oh, yeah.
How do those fit into all of this?
Reserve requirements are the amount of money that banks are required to hold in reserve.
Oh.
The central bank can adjust these requirements, which directly impacts how much money banks have available to lend out.
So it's another way to control the flow of money in the economy. And then, of course, there's the big one, setting interest rates.
That's the one everyone pays attention to.
Yeah.
By raising interest rates, the central bank makes it more expensive to borrow money, which can help slow down spending and investment, eventually cooling down inflation.
But raising interest rates can also make things harder for businesses and people who need loans, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Higher borrowing costs can put a strain on businesses and make it more difficult for people to buy homes or cars. It's a trade-off that the central bank has to weigh very carefully.
It sounds like they're walking a tightrope.
They are. And remember, here in Ireland, we're part of the Eurozone, which means the European Central Bank, or ECB, has the final say on those big picture interest rate decisions.
So our own central bank has a lot of responsibilities, like contributing to price stability and keeping the financial system running smoothly. But it's the ECB that ultimately calls the shots on monetary policy for the entire Eurozone.
That's right. It's a team effort.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about what causes inflation, the impact it has on all of us, how it's measured, and the roles of the government and the central bank in trying to keep it under control.
It's a lot.
It is, but what about us?
Yeah.
The everyday people trying to navigate this complex world of rising prices. What can we do to protect ourselves?
That's a great question. Well, we can't control those big economic forces. We can take steps to, you know, manage our own finances and try to minimize the impact of inflation on our lives.
The textbook doesn't really offer much in the way of personal finance advice. But based on what we've learned, what are some things that, people should keep in mind?
Well, one key takeaway is that holding on to too much cash during times of high inflation isn't the best strategy.
Yeah.
We've talked about how inflation erodes the purchasing power of cash. It's like watching your money slowly shrink in value.
So stashing all your savings under the mattress is probably not a good idea.
Probably not. It might be wise to consider investing in assets that tend to keep pace with inflation, like real estate or stocks.
But of course, any investment comes with risks, and it's crucial to do your research and maybe even talk to a financial advisor before making any big decisions.
Absolutely. Don't put all your eggs in one basket, right? Diversification is key.
Another important takeaway is the importance of budgeting and tracking your spending.
Yeah.
When prices are rising, it's more crucial than ever to understand where your money is going.
You're right. Look for ways to, cut back on unnecessary expenses, find cheaper alternatives.
Maybe it's time to reevaluate that streaming service you never watch.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Or try cooking at home more often instead of eating out all the time.
Those small changes can really add up over time. And don't be afraid to negotiate.
Negotiate? What do you mean?
I mean, don't be shy about asking for a better deal.
Yeah.
Whether it's for your cable bill, your cell phone plan,
Yeah.
or even your rent.
Okay.
You never know what you might be able to save.
That's a good point. And remember, wages don't always keep up with inflation.
That's right. We talked about that wage price spiral earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you're feeling the squeeze, don't be afraid to ask for a raise or explore other opportunities to boost your income.
Absolutely. Taking control of your finances is empowering, especially in challenging economic times.
By understanding how inflation works and the tools at our disposal, we can make smarter choices and weather the storm.
Exactly. Knowledge is power, and that's what this deep dive is all about.
And remember, inflation is a complex issue. There's no single solution or easy answer. It's influenced by a whole web of factors, both here in Ireland and around the world.
It's a global issue.
It is.
For sure.
But by staying informed, being proactive, and asking the right questions, we can navigate this challenging economic landscape.
We can.
So keep learning, keep those questions coming, and most importantly, keep diving deep.
We'll be back for the final part of our deep dive, where we'll explore even more fascinating aspects of this ever-evolving world of inflation. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into inflation. We've covered a lot of ground, from what causes prices to rise to how it affects your wallet and what the government and the central bank can do about it.
Yeah, we've talked about demand pull and cost push inflation, those tricky limitations of the consumer price index, and the delicate dance the central bank has to do to try and keep the economy stable.
But there's one more piece of the puzzle we need to explore.
Yep.
How does inflation impact the entire financial system? It's not just about the price of groceries, is it?
You're right. Inflation can send ripples through the whole financial system, affecting everything from interest rates to those exchange rates we mentioned earlier.
Our source material dives into how changes in the demand for and supply of money can set off a chain reaction across the economy.
It can.
So how does that work exactly?
Well, think about it this way. When there's more money circulating in the economy, people have more to spend.
Right.
And that can drive up demand for goods and services, which can push prices up even further. That's that demand pull inflation we talked about.
Right, and it also affects imports. If people have more money to burn, they might be more inclined to buy things from other countries.
Exactly. And that increased demand for imports can put downward pressure on the value of the euro. Think about it. If everyone's buying things from, say, the United States, they need to exchange their euros for US dollars.
Okay.
That increased demand for dollars and decreased demand for euros can make the euro weaker compared to the dollar.
So inflation can mess with exchange rates, which can create headaches for businesses that rely on importing or exporting goods.
For sure.
It's a complex web, and everything is interconnected.
It is.
And then there's the impact on those all-important interest rates.
Oh, yeah. Interest rates, right.
That's the central bank's main weapon in the fight against inflation, right?
Right. And it's a delicate balancing act.
Okay.
When the money supply increases, interest rates tend to fall. Think of it like this. If banks have more money to lend out,
Yeah,
they can offer lower interest rates to attract borrowers.
makes sense.
But when the money supply shrinks, interest rates tend to rise.
So if inflation is high, or if people expect inflation to rise, that can push those interest rates up.
That's exactly right. And those higher interest rates affect how much it costs for you to borrow money for a mortgage, a car loan, or even a business loan.
So it's like this constant feedback loop.
Yeah, it is.
The source material also points out the potential downsides of having too much or too little money in the economy.
You got it.
So it's all about striking the right balance.
It is.
Too much money can lead to that runaway inflation we've been talking about, but too little can stifle economic growth and even lead to something called deflation.
Yeah, deflation.
Deflation. That sounds scary. What exactly is that?
Deflation is when prices actually start going down consistently.
Okay.
And while you might think, hey, cheaper stuff, what's not to like?
Yeah, sounds pretty good.
It can actually be just as damaging as high inflation, if not more so.
Why is that?
Well, it can create a vicious cycle. When prices fall, people might hold off on buying things because they think prices will drop even further.
Okay, yeah.
That lower demand can then force businesses to lower their prices even more,
Right.
leading to more people waiting to buy. It's a downward spiral.
And that can be really bad for the economy as a whole.
Absolutely. Businesses might have to cut production, which can lead to job losses, and the whole economy can start to contract. It can be really hard to pull out of a deflationary spiral.
So the central bank has to walk a tightrope. They need to keep inflation in check, but they also need to make sure there's enough money in the economy to support growth.
It's a constant juggling act. They have to keep their eye on a whole range of economic indicators, everything from inflation and unemployment to interest rates and exchange rates. It's a complex job, but someone's got to do it.
It sounds like they have their work cut out for them.
They do. But understanding the basics of how inflation works and how it affects the entire financial system can help us all make more informed decisions. Whether you're managing your personal finances or running a business, having this knowledge is a valuable tool.
It's all about empowering ourselves to navigate these choppy economic waters. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the world of inflation, what are some key takeaways you want to leave our listeners with?
I think the biggest takeaway is that inflation is a complex and dynamic phenomenon. It's influenced by a multitude of factors, both domestically and globally, and it impacts everyone, but in different ways.
And while we can't control those global economic forces, we can learn about them, understand them, and make informed decisions based on that knowledge.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power, and that's what this deep dive has been all about.
We hope you found this journey insightful and maybe even a little bit empowering. Inflation can feel overwhelming, but remember, you're not alone in this. We're all in this together.
Keep learning, keep asking questions, and most importantly, keep diving deep.
That's it for this episode of The Deep Dive. We'll be back soon with another fascinating topic to explore. Until then, stay curious.